Hi, I'm Peter Tragos, host of the Lawyer You Know podcast and YouTube channel. The saying goes, everyone hates lawyers until you need one. Well, I'm here when you need one to answer your questions and give you insight that you didn't know you needed. Along with my partners, Pete Sardis, the professor, who has a finance and business background, and George Tragos, my dad, and the consigliere, a criminal defense giant, we can answer any questions you have. What's up, everybody? We are here with a randomly non-scheduled live to talk about the verdict that's in. Sunny Balwani, it feels like we've been following this case for literally months. It's part of a bigger Theranos saga that's been going on for years. And we finally have the final culmination, at least from the federal criminal side, from the two co-defendants that were running this company, charged with 12 counts each, I believe. And we know Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on some counts and not others. We'll compare these convictions. We'll compare the potential sentences. We'll compare the potential fines. But just starting out, why don't we tell everybody, Pete, what was Sunny Balwani convicted of, if anything?
Sunny Balwani ate the whole pie. He was convicted on all 12 counts. You were right. 10 actual fraud counts and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud. So he got convicted of absolutely everything.
And compare that to Elizabeth Holmes' convictions.
See, Elizabeth Holmes, frankly, now that you look at it, did great. She was convicted of 4 counts, but she was hung on 3 counts. The jury was hung. They didn't come to a verdict. And the government actually dismissed one of the fraud counts against the patients during the trial, and she got acquitted of, 4 counts. So she only has 4 counts of conviction.
But when it comes down to what that actually means, let's talk about, because I know when we did the Elizabeth Holmes verdict, we talked a lot about how she wasn't convicted against the actual people. So compare that to what Bhawani was convicted of and why you think that was, because you actually guessed that he may end up even worse off than her because the government learned something from the first trial.
Right. Let me kind of answer that in reverse. I thought that the government learned a lot from the first trial. And because of what they learned since Balwani was charged the exact same things that Elizabeth Holmes was charged with, the government had an opportunity to kind of tweak their presentation. That way, they had a much better shot of convicting Sunny on the counts that they lost on Elizabeth Holmes. Now, to back it up just one step, your question to me really is, what does it mean with the different counts? Honestly, not much. Each one of these counts has a 20-year maximum sentence. So the reality is, if the government would have gotten a conviction on just a single count, that's enough for them to be able to get in front of a judge and for a judge to convict on up to a 20-year maximum. Now, the truth of the matter is, I don't know if it's going to make much of a difference between Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, the fact they've actually been convicted of different numbers of counts. I promise you that Elizabeth Holmes' lawyers are going to make beef about it at sentencing, but ultimately it doesn't really make sense based on the sentencing guidelines and how federal sentencings actually work.
So I'm going in and out because I'm texting with Rachel because some people are saying your mic is crackling. I think it was a little too loud. So we've turned it down a little bit. Okay. You should be fine.
Right.
You should be fine. Rachel fixed it. So I think it's good now, chat, for everybody saying that he's crackling a little bit. So hopefully we've gotten that fixed. So although it might not seem like a big difference, what is it going to look like? Did you already talk about, sorry, because I was texting with Rachel. Did you talk about whether or not it's going to affect the sentence that he was convicted of more counts than Elizabeth Holmes?
Yeah, I talked about that. It's not going to affect the sentence. I went back and kind of looked at the numbers. When we did the Elizabeth Holmes sentencing calculation, at the time, the conversation was that it was something in the $950 million range of loss. And that's one of the elements that the court takes into consideration in order to sentence somebody. And at $950 million, she was literally off the chart. So, she was looking at 20-year maximum sentence, no matter how you look at it, because her score was more than the statutory maximum of 20 years. Ever since that came out, there's been different grumblings, and it looks like the real number is going to be more like about $144 million, which was the exact number that the government argued during the Balwani trial. So at $144 million, they still both score somewhere between 17 and 20 years, just based on a guideline score.
Okay, so when we talk about what we think their sentence is going to be, for all of you who may be newer to the channel or newer to this stream or newer to this case and don't know what's going on in the Balwani and Theranos case, I'm going to have Pete explain just a brief factual background. But if you really want to know about the sentencing and what it might be and how it works, Pete did a full breakdown of how we do sentencing score sheets and guidelines, what we look at, and why we're coming to numbers in the 17 to 20-year range, what he's talking about when he says statutory maximums. He did a full breakdown of that. So go check it out on it will be on the Elizabeth Holmes playlist, not the Sunny Balwani playlist, because we have separate playlists for the trials. But give just a brief factual background of how we got here, what this case is that we're talking about. Both co-defendants have now been convicted of federal crimes.
Right. So to take this thing back to about like 2004, 2005, Elizabeth Holmes was a young lady that was in college in California. At some point, she comes up with this idea that she wants to create a system where a single finger stick of blood, so basically a drop of blood, could be used to test for all sorts of ailments, as opposed to having people to come get full vials of blood drawn, which is a huge deal for people that are, for example, cancer patients or people that have, serious disease states that require a lot of blood testing. It was a godsend. So what winds up happening is they start a company. She drops out of college and they begin Theranos. And Theranos is the company that was supposed to revolutionize the world of blood testing. Ultimately, Elizabeth Holmes meets Sunny Balwani. They actually met in China when she was a teenager. He was married because he's like 26 something years older than she is. And ultimately, he winds up getting divorced. She becomes an adult and they start dating in secret. He comes on board and becomes the chief operating officer of the company. He winds up investing about $15 million of his own dollars into the company, and they kind of take this thing public. What wound up happening, what the trial really was about, is the fact that at some point, Elizabeth Holmes was out there soliciting money. And frankly, at this point, Sunny Balwani was out there, running a company. And they knew that the technology they were touting didn't work. So they had this concept, and they call it fake it till you make it in Silicon Valley. And that's just the way, apparently, the lifestyle of startups worked until Theranos imploded, because all these huge people, and I'm talking about the wealthiest families in America, wound up investing in this thing, and it just came crashing down because the technology literally didn't work. The government came in and shut down the laboratories. The U.S. Attorney's Office indicts both Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani. Elizabeth went to trial in January. We talked about it. She got convicted of 4 of 12 counts. Sunny Balwani figured he'd try his luck too. He started his trial, I think, in March, if I'm not mistaken, or April. And things didn't go so hot for him as of today.
And that's not unusual for the government to get better at it and make the conviction even better. Because we talk about how federal cases, the government wins 95% of the time. And so if they get 2 cracks at it, it's even a higher likelihood that they're going to get a conviction. For people saying that there might be something wrong with my mic, no, I just lost my voice. So that's fine. And I'm feeling great. So don't worry about it there. I'm feeling great. So when we talk about these kinds of cases and how the government tried the case, you gave updates throughout, and it didn't seem like there was a lot of difference between how they tried the case between Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, except for maybe some things they cleaned up in order to streamline it. And it took less time to try Balwani, right?
About 2 weeks less.
Right, which they streamlined the case. Jury was probably happy about that. They get all their convictions, and now we're here. For anybody that wants a Hollywood version of the events and what happened, there's also a mini series called The Dropout, right? Dropout,
correct.
That's what it's called. With Amanda Seyfried, that kind of goes through this case. If you want to see some of the facts, how things kind of happened in the Hollywood version, Pete did a series of videos breaking out kind of the differences and what was real, what wasn't real, if you want to get some of that as well. But if you're interested in this case, definitely check that out and check out the videos on our channel, because Pete's done a ton on this, a ton of breakdowns. It's in federal court. We didn't get cameras there. Why not? It's a question we get every video. Why weren't there cameras on this trial?
Yeah, the federal courts are really stringent about what can come in, and the rule is very simple. No recording devices can be inside of the courtroom except for the official federal court reporter. And the reason they do that is they just don't want to have any questions about whether a court reporter got something down correctly or got it down wrong. They don't want to be able to have people come in and say, well, I've audio recorded it, and my version is different than your version. That way, they just completely ban any recordings at all inside of federal courts.
Correct, and we don't see that changing anytime soon.
No.
So we've talked about the sentencing. Sonny Balwani's will be kicked out. There'll be a sentencing memorandum or pre-sentence report. All that stuff will happen with Sonny Bhawani, but that's already started in Elizabeth Holmes. When is her sentencing?
Yeah, her sentencing is actually scheduled for September 26th, and that's obviously a long time since her conviction. Her conviction was back in January, so it's been, what, almost 7 months since that happened. I was curious. I kind of ran the numbers, and it is possible that the judge could sentence Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes together. He could do it either in September, or there might be a chance that the judge continues Elizabeth Holmes out and actually, just for purposes of judicial economy, do both sentencings at the same time. Since, in fact, they're charged with the exact same crimes, they are the co-defendants, they both went to trial. He could really do it that way if he wanted.
I'd be surprised if he did, though. I mean,
Yeah.
separate trials, I would expect him to sentence them separately. Okay, so September 26th comes. What does that look like? Tell them about what a sentencing hearing looks like. Does the judge make the decision on that day? Is she going in shackles and going to prison that day? How does it work?
Yeah, the judge actually on September 26th will do this. Will have the sentencing hearing. There'll be a presentation done by the prosecution and by the defense. I'm not certain how long the defense's sentencing presentation is going to be, but let's be real: 15-week trial. It could be more than one day. Ultimately, whenever the presentations are done, the judge will actually render a sentence that day. It'll be in open court. He'll tell Elizabeth Holmes what her sentence is going to be, how she's going to serve it. That includes if there's any fines, penalties, if there's going to be any restitution amount. And the chances that Elizabeth Holmes goes to jail then and there are probably slim, because this is a white-collar case, and because it's a financial fraud, there's no real risk to the community to allow her to self-surrender directly to a federal prison. Again, we talked about that in one of the Elizabeth Holmes episodes where we did how sentencing works. And the truth is, the judge is probably going to let her just show up to jail, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever the U.S. Marshals tells her what facility she's going to be assigned to and what day to show up on.
So, and it also wouldn't surprise me in the inverse, where if she did go to prison that day, because, like you said, she's been out, right, for 7 months, or is she in custody?
She's been out.
That's what I thought. So the fact that she's been out for 7+ months, it wouldn't surprise me if he said, no, you're going to prison today, or if they give her some indication like, get your things in order now, because you're going to go to prison the day of sentencing. So it could go either way. There's no,
of course,
the judge doesn't have to let her have some time.
That's right.
But he can give her some time if he wants to. So we'll see what happens, because it would be interesting to see if he just says, yeah, you're going to prison today or tomorrow or, very soon after.
Sure. And let me just add, self-surrender is a big deal for criminal defendants in white-collar cases, because if you self-surrender to the Bureau of Prisons, the Bureau of Prisons will classify you in a lower category for where you actually serve your time. So I know that the defense is going to be pushing really hard for that.
Yeah, absolutely. How long did it take for them to get to the Balwani verdict? How long was the jury out for?
It was a full 7 days. No, what am I saying? For Balwani?
I thought it was 4.
I'm sorry, it was 4 days for Balwani, 7 days for Elizabeth Holmes.
So they took, and it makes sense, right? Because they came back with a lot of not guilties. So they discussed a lot more in the Elizabeth Holmes case, longer trial, longer deliberation, less guilty verdicts. But during the Balwani deliberation, I know you did a video, there were some juror questions that maybe indicated to you, I think you thought maybe they weren't going to convict him on everything. Maybe we'd even have some hung counts. So what were those questions, and why did you think that?
The one question that really struck me was when the jury came back to the judge and said, we can't agree on a count. Is there anything other than guilty or not guilty that we can come back with if we don't agree? And to me, that was an indicator to say there must not be enough evidence on at least one count for the jury to find beyond reasonable doubt that Sonny Balwani is guilty of that count. And I thought they were at least going to come back with, if not one, a couple of counts not guilty. But apparently the judge did instruct him and said, no, it doesn't work that way. You've got to be unanimous, and you've got to make a decision whether or not the government has proven the case beyond reasonable doubt. And you've got to say, if it is beyond a reasonable doubt, it's guilty. If it's not, then you've got to come back with not guilty. So apparently some opinions got swayed.
Yeah, and it's more likely, honestly, it's more unlikely that it comes down like Elizabeth Holmes. More likely that once they give you guilty on a couple, they're like, yeah, if we're not positive, I think the government probably proved their case, guilty. That's actually more common. What happens in cases like this with multiple counts, all coming from a similar set of facts, really. In order to dig in and find factual differences is actually more unusual for a jury. All right. So that's everything pretty much with the verdict, with the comparisons of the Elizabeth Holmes case. The last thing I'm going to have Pete do is just kind of explain what he thinks this means for venture capitalism for these kinds of cases. So get your questions in now, because after Pete kind of explains this, we're going to do about 15, 20 minutes of questions. And Rachel's going to throw them up on the screen, and we're just going to go through them one by one. We'll answer as many as we can. We're obviously not going to be able to answer every question. We'll answer as many as we can. So get the questions in now, and then we'll start answering them in a couple minutes for about 15 minutes.
Okay. There was a guy in Silicon Valley that started a company known as Oracle. And most of you that like work in, in a corporate environment know who Oracle is. They're a huge software company. And one of the things that he had touted at the time that Oracle, actually after Oracle went public and was super successful, he had actually said openly and publicly that it didn't actually work until they went public. And they actually wound up having to do a lot of bug fixes after they had already gone public, after they already sold to everybody that this technology worked. This verdict, or these verdicts between with Holmes and Balwani, is going to send a very clear message to venture capital firms, especially in Silicon Valley. And the message is, you can't just lie to people anymore. You can't fake it till you make it. If things aren't working and you know they don't work because the company fails, we're going to hold you accountable, and there's a good chance you're going to go to prison, which, by the way, I think this may very well be the first time corporate officers have actually gone to prison in a white-collar venture capital case. Now, people have gone to prison because, they've stolen the money and, fled to Israel or something.
Or Ponzi schemes.
Or Ponzi schemes where there really is no investment. But this is a legitimate company with a legitimate software and a hardware product with employees. Like, it really existed. But it just didn't work all the way. And I think that the message is, if it doesn't work all the way, don't go public with it, or don't tout that it works if it doesn't.
And that's easy for us to say now. But you, in the very beginning of this case, you said lots of companies start out like that. Mm-hmm. Lots of great products that have changed the world obviously don't work a lot before they start working. The difference with this one is they pushed it too far, too fast, and they basically did lie and commit fraud about what it could actually do at the time that they were saying it and what kind of contracts they had and things like that. So very interesting to see.
Yeah, which is really crazy. It was really crazy that they did this, because the truth of the matter is a lot of venture capital firms go years without actually turning a profit. Amazon's a perfect example. They went a decade without turning a profit, and obviously look how profitable it is now. I don't know why they did what they did, because they had a good idea. I think at some point, maybe not this year, maybe next, it would have eventually worked. Right. So just keep pushing the ball down the road. But
they got too greedy too quickly. Basically, they wanted it to be billions before it was ready.
Right.
Okay, so we're about to get to the questions. If you haven't hit the like button already on the video, please hit the like button. If you are new to the Theranos saga, check out the two playlists, Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Bhawani, on our YouTube page. If you're here from that and you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button so we can keep rolling along with the content. And you can let us know what content you like by commenting in the comments or liking the videos that you enjoy watching, because that's what drives what videos we make. All right, Rachel, let's get to the first question. What happens to the victims who got bad results and suffered as a result? Is it just sorry?
Okay, there's going to be a restitution number that is going to be put out by the court. That means Sunny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes are going to have to pay people back money. The truth of the matter is, what are the chances that Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani are going to be able to pay these humongous numbers at any point in time? Elizabeth Holmes, for all intents and purposes, is broke. Sunny Balwani has millions. He's still a multimillionaire. There's a good chance a lot of that money is somehow protected. I presume he has some sort of asset protection.
I'm sure.
But if not, they're going to make them pay like $12 a month out of their commissary accounts while they're in prison. So for all intents and purposes, yeah, they're probably screwed.
Random question. This has nothing to do with the case, but from your intro, what is a conciliary? I haven't been able to check a live to ask recently. Ashley, so the big thing it comes from is The Godfather. Tom was the family lawyer, and it's basically the mafiosa lawyer, like the lawyer that helps the mob and keeps them clean and keeps them out of trouble and things like that. So criminal defense lawyer is what I think of.
Yeah.
Like, back in the day, that kind of criminal defense lawyer. How would you describe it, Pete? Any different?
Well, consigliere in Italian actually just means counselor. So that's
Right.
what he's the counselor for the mafia, but the mob does use that term.
Right. All right, Peggy. Is this the same Oracle company that gives regular updates on my computer? Sorry if this is a goofy question.
Yep, that's them. Same company.
All right, next one. Oscar D. Does Sonny automatically appeal?
Absolutely. And so Elizabeth Holmes. I don't think there is any world where they don't actually file appeals within 14 days of their sentences being rendered. They're going to get big prison sentences. They may not be 20 years. You know, the court may realize that those numbers are a little extreme and could downward depart. But I'm telling you, they're going to prison for a long time. And people like this, and what I mean by that is white collar folks that aren't used to, you know, being in jail or being in prison. A day is too long for them, but they're going to serve that prison sentence until the appeal comes back. I don't think the judge is going to let them stay out of jail pending the appeal.
And what's interesting to me too is if they get 20 years, which is kind of their max, or anywhere near there, Ghislaine Maxwell got 20 years.
Right.
So let me know in the chat for any of those that have followed the Ghislaine Maxwell case with us, and if you haven't, go check it out on the channel on that playlist. Who do you think deserves more prison time? They're both federal felony convictions. Ghislaine Maxwell or the Theranos defendants? Let me know in the chat. It's a pretty easy one for me, who I think deserves more prison time. But it's just wild to think with these kind of big numbers how you can get huge prison sentences. All right, next one. Charlie Delta Whiskey. Do you think it hurt Sonny that he didn't testify in his own defense? Because Elizabeth Holmes did testify. Yep. Sonny Bhawani didn't. She gets some not guilty counts. He gets guilty across the board. Do you think it hurt him at the end of the day?
See, we're talking about two different people. And the truth of the matter is Elizabeth Holmes, for however we feel about her today, obviously is a charismatic person. She got the world's richest and most powerful people to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in her company on her word. So she's obviously very likable, very charismatic, and I think her defense team made a good choice putting her up there. I don't know Sonny Balwani, but I can see how Sonny Balwani, based on the representations I've heard about his character, could have been not a good witness, meaning he could have torpedoed his chances of having some not guilty just because he's a little bit gruff. I think he's a little aggressive and just not as a likable of a guy. So again, the defendant makes that decision. The judge did tell the jury that they cannot use his silence against him. You know, you can't, presume he's not testifying, therefore he must be guilty. So there are some safeguards put in place, but I don't know if he hurt himself. Obviously, we can speculate now because he's been convicted of everything. But there's a really good chance that he very well could have been convicted of everything if he did testify.
There was also some differences in the facts that came out with how he berated people, how he was kind of nasty to some people, and what Elizabeth Holmes said about him that he would have had to answer to that she didn't have during her trial, because she said he was basically controlling and he was abusive basically to her verbally, and had this control over her. So he would have had to answer all those questions that the government would have, and she didn't have that when she took the stand. So there were some differences there as well. All right, next question. Thank you, T in Tennessee, for the super sticker. I also saw that somebody said it was just announced November 15th is Sonny Bhawani's sentencing date. Okay. So not quite as long of a wait as Elizabeth Holmes got. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, Elizabeth Holmes actually had a baby. And if you're asking my opinion, I think she actually did it purposely to try to somehow gather some sympathy or, to get a little favor with the court. Honestly, Sonny Balwani doesn't have that opportunity because even if he did have a baby, he's not the one having the baby. So I think the court did give her some time because of that. And that really is, I think, the big difference between why somebody gets 6 months between conviction and sentencing, and why Sonny Balwani at this point is what? July, August, September, October, November, 4 months.
I saw somebody ask what the difference is between a pre-sentence investigation, pre-sentence report. You do the investigation and then produce the report. So it's all part of the same thing. I'm looking through the chat here and I see the vast majority of people saying Ghislaine Maxwell deserves more time. Oh, here's the pre-sentence investigation question. The vast majority of people thinking Ghislaine Maxwell deserves more prison time than Elizabeth Holmes, but there are a couple votes for Holmes And there are a couple votes saying equal because they've both been federally convicted. So the way the guidelines work, that could happen. But most people think, yeah, like Kathleen here, Ghislaine Maxwell deserves all the time they could possibly give her.
Yeah.
All right, next question. Melanie Casio. Wait, I'm confused. Was it not illegal to lie to their investors?
That's a great question. There is case law out of the Ninth Circuit, which is over in California, that says it's not illegal to lie to your investors as long as that lie does not materially affect their decision making or their investment. I know that's the strangest opinion I've ever read in a court, but the truth is, yes, it is illegal to lie to them if you're lying to them in order to entice them to give you money under false pretenses, which is what fraud is.
Right. I saw somebody post R. Kelly got more time. Yes, he did. Expat. Random questions. 1, can someone in federal prison start and operate a company?
No, you're not allowed to do business while you're in prison. That's actually a rule that the federal prisons and the state prisons have, and they notify you of that when you get there.
2, can they use their time to write an autobiography and profit off the earnings?
That's a good question. Yes, you can write an autobiography. Can you profit from it? Yes, but for the fact that the government will come back and seize those assets in order to pay back the investors.
Correct. Yeah, like because they've got all these fines, they've got restitution, they've got court costs, all sorts of stuff that if they did write something based on this, sometimes judges put it as part of the sentencing or part of the punishment that you actually can't do stuff like this.
Right.
So it is interesting, and we'll see if that happens in any of these cases that we're seeing criminal convictions on. Are Sonny and Elizabeth now estranged? Melanie is asking.
If they weren't before, they sure as heck are now. Yeah, I understand
sure.
that they ended their relationship even before the charges came out, and I don't think that they're friendly at all, since Elizabeth Holmes is actually married now to somebody else, and Sonny Balwani is probably not happy with her since he just got convicted.
Azam, what's up? Thanks for the super sticker. Azam is somebody who is learning a lot about the law here. And this case is perfect because we're talking about a venture capitalist case, federal court, California, where this is the hub for these kinds of companies and this kind of business and these kind of investors. So this is really interesting when you see the exact kind of case that centers around, it would be like, agriculture and other parts of the world, something to do with that. This is the perfect spot for a case like this, and they are cracking down, and it could affect how it happens there in the future. All right, Rayanne, why was Elizabeth Holmes' trial first, even after postponing due to pregnancy?
That was a decision that the government made. She is the lead defendant because technically she's the CEO, so they decided to go against her first. Obviously, they could have done it another way if that's how they wanted to do it, but that frankly, I think the decision was to try Elizabeth Holmes first, hoping that Sonny Balwani would make a deal and just plead. But it didn't work out that way.
All right, next question. Son of Prince. Holmes is now wealthy by marriage. Does her husband's money get attached to any judgment against her?
No, because he is not involved in this fraud at all. The government cannot attach any assets that are not Elizabeth Holmes' sole assets in order to satisfy any of either the fines or the restitution amount.
Jean Hood. Seems unfair to me that Sonny got convicted of all 12 and she only got 4. I mean, it may seem unfair, but that's how it works sometimes. I mean, there's nothing there's nothing really. I mean, he could try to use something in his appeal to say the government didn't actually prove those charges, but the fact that she was not guilty of those charges is really not going to help him much, right?
Right. And I'll tell you the other thing, Gene, the reality is in federal cases, most of the time the prosecutors will go after the lead defendant, meaning the most culpable guy, and see if they can flip that person to testify against everybody else. The interesting part about federal sentencing, at least in conspiracy cases, is normally if they can get the lead person or the lead defendant to cooperate, that person gets the least amount of time. Everybody else who is less culpable than they are winds up doing more prison time than they do. And this is exactly the same way that it happened here for Sonny Balwani.
Yeah, I see people asking, when did Elizabeth Holmes go to trial? Already happened early in this year. When is she getting sentenced? September,
September.
Said. Yeah, Bhawani's going to get sentenced in November. We think we haven't confirmed that yet, but that's what we think is going to happen. So it's all the trials are done. Both have convictions. Both are going to get sentenced soon. Pete will do videos after the September sentencing hearing and after the November sentencing hearing, comparing, contrasting them, seeing what the difference is in. Maybe before each sentencing hearing, he'll give kind of a guess as to, I think she'll get this many years versus him, and who will get more and why. Maybe he'll look into that a little more and do a video before we get there. Jaku, wow, guilty on all counts. That's something. At Tragos, so sorry for an off-topic, thirsty comment, but man, you could totally work as a model. Thanks, Jaku.
Obviously, he's talking about me.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're getting kind of close to the bottom of the questions here. So if you have any questions, we're going to do about 2 or 3 more minutes. So get them in now. But Pete, with these 2 convictions, anybody else that's involved in Theranos, do you think that potential criminal charges could come? Are we done? Is this the end of the line as far as who was culpable criminally when it comes to Theranos and what they did?
During the Balwani trial, there was actually a hearing that was held, and the government's lawyers made some representations that there was some parts of the evidence that had to be talked about in camera, meaning outside the hearing of the jury and of the public, because there were still ongoing investigations, which leads me to believe this isn't over yet. There is a very good chance that based on what they've learned in this investigation, obviously prosecuting Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, they have found other people that they believe may be culpable in either providing false information or actively doing something that perpetrated a fraud. So I think that this is not over. I don't think you're going to see any big trials anymore.
Well, and anybody else would probably take some kind of plea deal, I would think. But we could also see potentially Elizabeth Holmes or Sunny Balwani pointing the finger at some of the underlings to try to get their sentence lessened by getting a bigger group of people. But in reality, they together were kind of the dual head of this snake. Do you agree? I mean, this is who the government wanted, and this is who they got. So anything else, I think, is going to pale in comparison to what they were trying to get convicting Sunny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes.
Right. I don't think you're going to see a lot of serious press coverage from this point forward for any other defendants.
All right. Last couple questions here. Peggy, what happens now to the company?
The company's gone, Peggy. The company folded.
It never was really anything. I mean, it never really worked. What happened? They were actually sending it out to multiple companies to try to come up with results, right?
Well,
they weren't ever actually doing what they...
That's exactly. They wound up realizing that after they got the contracts with Walgreens, they needed to do something. So they wound up buying a series of Siemens machines, and those are like traditional machines, and they would dilute the blood to give the machine enough volume so they could actually do the tests. But remember, Theranos had an actual office building in Silicon Valley, and they had, hundreds of employees. They had desks and chairs and computers, all that stuff. And it just literally one day it ended, and they just abandoned everything.
Brian, is there a chance for winning the appeal given the judge didn't allow prior lab failures by lab director to be brought into trial? So, Pete, hold on. Before you answer this one specifically, but post-sentencing, we'll probably have some more appellate content for Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani. If there are any good reasons for appeal, what we're kind of hearing come down the pipe, what motions we'll hear, what kind of post-trial motions we see, what they're focusing on for appeal, we'll get a better idea of that. But specifically to this one reason, do you think it's a good issue for appeal?
I think it's a good issue for appeal. Brian, do I think that they're going to get an acquittal or a dismissal of the indictment based on this? No. They might get a new trial. And even that, frankly, based on this alone, may be a stretch, because the court very well, I could see them saying that, yes, this was wrong. The court should have allowed this testimony, but it's not enough to negate the jury's findings.
Is it something they let in during the Elizabeth Holmes trial?
No, they didn't let in. They didn't know about it during the Elizabeth Holmes trial. It came out kind of in between, and Balwani's lawyers wanted to obviously to take advantage of it, because what Brian's talking about is the lab director. Come to find out, he'd worked for like some companies after Theranos, and they also had problems with the U.S. government based on the way he was running the lab. So they had some lab shutdowns in other companies outside of Theranos because of this guy. The point was Balwani was trying to say...
Seems relevant to me.
Absolutely. Balwani's point is, I may have been responsible, but this guy was the actual doctor. So I
Yeah,
defer to whatever he said.
definitely seems relevant to me. And what's fun about this stuff is Pete's actually done a lot of appeals, especially criminal appeals. We don't do as many of them now, but earlier in our law firm career, like before I got here, I mean, you did multiple
Dozens.
appeals,
Yeah,
double
dozens.
digits of appeals.
Mhm.
And we've actually won a bunch of appeals,
Mhm.
and especially criminal appeals, especially federal criminal
Mhm.
appeals. One case we won 2 federal criminal appeals after losing the trial. So he'll be able to tell you if there even is a chance. And I'll tell you, I was around when he was doing a lot of these appeals, and a lot of them are long shots. I mean, we know doing the appeal that's going to be really, really hard to actually be successful on appeal. So why don't you talk about that? Even if they do have some good issues for appeal, how difficult is it?
Yeah. First of all, let me just tell you that there are limitations on appeals, meaning you can't just file a 10,000 page brief. There are page
Right.
limits. There are, limitations on the issues that you can raise. So you as a lawyer, as an appellate lawyer, really have to spend a lot of time figuring out what are your best issues and really honing in on what you think you can win on. The problem is
You used
there's
to come
always,
in, sorry to
yeah,
interrupt
go
you,
ahead.
but Pete used to come in to my dad's office with 23 issues. And they would sit there and be like, okay, which 3 are we going to pick? And
Right.
that's one of the things about being a lawyer. You got to pick the right stuff, and you've got to be able to put all the information and arguments and case law you need in a limited amount of time and space. So, I mean, that is one of the skills of doing these
Mhm.
appeals, especially in federal court, where they tell you what font you can use in
Mhm.
the appeal. It's wild. Okay, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, no worries. And then part two, I guess, of this discussion, when you're doing these appeals, you have to understand that you're at a disadvantage. At this point, especially after a jury trial, the court is going to consider that the jury's verdict is appropriate because that's what they're obligated to do. So you're talking about, a losing proposition right off the bat. And unless you can actually find something that is going to convince an appellate jury panel of 3 judges that something happened during the trial just was fundamentally unfair to you, chances of you winning a new trial or getting your entire case dismissed are probably slim. But let me turn the tables, Brian, and tell you this is going to be appealed to the Ninth Circuit, which is California. So if I had to take a chance at an appeal, I pick that jurisdiction every time. They're the most liberal jurisdiction in the country and most likely to reverse a conviction.
Mo, I see your comment about could you imagine Elaine in a federal trial? She would she would be shut down immediately and admonished by the court for speaking objections. The way that she tries to enter evidence, it would be a totally different look. It wouldn't look as bad, honestly, for her because they would box her in so early on and admonish the way that she handled it. Just there are different lawyers that try cases in federal court than in state court. It's a different world. It would not sound anything like that, I promise you. All right, last maybe like 2 questions. Let's see. I think I love the Q&A sorry, Janelle. I love the Q&A session. Thank you, Janelle. All right, next question here. Brian again. Ex-CEO Trevor Milton of Nikola Motors federal trial starts this July. Are you planning to cover that trial? Do you know anything about that, Pete?
I don't. I know what Nikola Motors is. I didn't realize there was a federal trial. We can look into it and
Yeah,
see what
we'll
it's all
have Pete
about.
look into it and see what it is, see what the comparisons are. Definitely write that down. Pete's taking a note. You can tell. Yeah, we'll definitely look into it, Brian. Thanks for your questions, man. Syracuse Brad, do you think this was more a puppet master situation or group conspiracy?
Let me tell you, I honestly believe that Elizabeth Holmes did not think this was going to go the way it was. And I believe a lot of the guidance she got from very successful venture capital folks that had succeeded, they're the ones that told her to do this. I really do believe, like, she was very young when this happened. I also think that Sonny Balwani did not come into this company to invest millions of his own dollars knowing that it's a fraud. But I think
No
what
way.
happens at some point, they both realize it's a fraud, but they're so invested in it. They've got so much of their own money, time, into this company that they start cutting corners saying, well, we'll just keep this going. We'll get this thing to work. It really will work. And they start believing and drinking their own Kool-Aid. And that's when things go south because Sonny Balwani had made multiple millions of dollars in the dot-com boom in California, in Silicon Valley. So he knows how this stuff works. And there was no reason for him to get involved if he thought it was a fraud from day one. But at some point, he knew it was a fraud. And as opposed to saying, we're done and walking away, or telling the investors, hey, we have a problem. Things are not as we originally had told you. They just kind of kept the charade going.
All right, let's finish with a Zoms comment. Thank you, lawyer. Learn new things. Clap. Thank you for all the love in the chat. You guys enjoyed having both of us on. Thanks, Pete, for jumping on with us to explain this and keeping the coverage of it up. We'll talk more about sentencing, more about appeal in this case. Maybe we'll look into a new federal criminal case that was mentioned on this stream. This was fun. Appreciate everybody coming in. You guys make it fun with the questions so we can see what content you're interested in on this case and give you the answers that you're looking for. Thanks again, Pete, for coming on. But for now, that's all we got.
Take care, all.
Pete, you got to hit the end, bro.